Anyway, has the recording started? Have I been too silly for the?
Yeah, well, it's recording, so.
Oh, snap! Welcome myself to Jake's podcast.
I guess I want to start by saying, like, I personally consider myself pretty far left in the political spectrum. And I think that has to do somewhat with a priority of my values and the hierarchy of my own values. But it also has to do with just, like, I'm sure with the set of facts and environment I've been exposed to in my life. And what I've been trying to contend, and so I've been focusing on the left because that's where I can have nuance and criticism that's actually informed. I don't really know too much about, like, I haven't lived in any right circles. I've lived in a sort of leftist liberal bubble. And so I'm going to talk for a second about what I like there and what I've been contending with there. So primarily, what I've been contending with, well, what I like is I think there's a strong focus on academic support for the disenfranchised and the destitute, right? And I think that's, like, my primary motivation. And I think, at least ostensibly, what most people on the left would say is their primary motivation. I think that what I want to contend with is, like, the realization that there's a lot of more radical or extremely radical movements that are destructive, that can be destructive if their, like, aims are ultimately achieved. But, like, it's not only what they say they want to do, it's like there's explicit academic ties to, like, maybe violent revolutionary Marxism. And I think that although, like, Marxist, as we discussed before, I think their aims are good in that it's going to eliminate poverty. I think the like, ultimately it's counterproductive. And I don't, like, want to, just tear down the radical ideas without building up something back in their place, because I think their causes are extremely important. I don't take that lightly, but I want to see if, like, the Marxist criticism is valid of these movements on the far left, and if it is valid, then what can we replace these movements with? So we covered a lot of ground in this podcast, and I also thought it would just be helpful to give a really quick overview of the main ideas of what we talked about and how I see critical theory now. So postmodernism and critical theory, two of the most politically relevant and controversial philosophies at the moment, are where we begin, with my hope being to strengthen the philosophical underpinnings of the left. So critical theories in general do make fairly radical, explicit philosophical claims. Primarily, the argument is that our values and ideology are a large cause of oppression itself. And that often leads to a rejection of liberalism, along with capitalism and meritocracy and things like that. It generally sees the world as oppressor and oppressed and interrogates society for these power differentials. So, for example, one instance applied to wealth would be Marxism, although Marxism actually preceded critical theory and inspired a lot of it. One immensely positive contribution of critical theory that perhaps we didn't touch enough on in this podcast is that, in the face of radical inequality, it aims to not blame oppressed people for their own oppression. So one instance of a critical theory, and taking a lot of inspiration from critical theory in general, is critical race theory, for instance. And so this looks for subtle ways in which current institutions, policies, and norms have disparate impacts for different races, even for superficially race-neutral policy. And these disparate impacts make a lot of sense for marginalized groups, even from superficially non-discriminatory policies, given the past historical discrimination that has put each group in a unique context and starting point. So, for instance, given historical segregation in the United States, which has concentrated Black poverty into certain geographic locations, racial inequality can be exacerbated by pooling resources at the community level, for instance, funding education by local property tax. Another example is, vagrancy laws enacted immediately after the abolition of slavery clearly had a disparate impact. And these subtle and disparate impacts of superficially group neutral policy likewise can exacerbate gender inequality. And you could look at critical gender theory or simply wealth inequality, which itself can contribute to all of the others pretty directly. So these disparate outcomes could be evaluated for all policies as they're prevalent, and the accumulation of these the inequality caused by disparate outcomes across policies produces institutional barriers. And these disparate impacts applies to norms and ideology as well, which is kind of the point of critical theory, creating ideological oppression or cultural hegemony, which is generally the target of critical theory more broadly. There is real truth in the claim that norms and arbitrary standards privilege some groups, oppressors over others oppressed. Rugged individualism, arbitrary standards for beauty, behavior, and grammar. Additionally, the clear disparate impacts of policy are actually downstream of these norms. So for instance, an emphasis on individualistic values may lead to a local tax that exacerbates racial inequality, as I mentioned before. However, although critical theory fixes these immense problems and is vitally important, it also has to be recognized that there can be counterproductive damage at the extremes of critical theory, whether this is in the literal texts or just in the way it's realized in political discussion today. And this is largely what we focus on in this podcast. So a few different examples. First, it can go too far when fundamental values are adjusted, that is, standards are flattened, instead of solving any underlying problem in conflict with those standards. For instance, undoing meritocracy or attributing it to a perverse dominant culture, instead of actually fixing the underlying inequality leading to unequal merit, skill, or contribution. Two, values are criticized that are actually beneficial and necessary for society to function in the long term. We talk about a Smithsonian museum attributing useful cultural emphasis on science and empiricism to just an arbitrary white standard. And another example here would be liberal values with long-term implications, such as freedom of speech. And three, important systems or arbitrary standards are removed without a less harmful alternative put in its place. So, burning down regulated capitalism instead of finding a solution for the effective generation and redistribution of wealth. And I label these the postmodern, anti-enlightenment / illiberal critiques and the anarchic critique, respectively. This is a problem of philosophy, not just policy, and has broad long-term implications as the underpinning of policy. And before I actually let this begin, I just want to link out to some useful content. Since we never really put anything back in the place of what we criticize, I recorded a video doing that. I argue ultimately that a critical theory lens is vital, but solving the underlying issues identified by that lens will entail liberal solutions. For a discussion of this potential solution and some background on critical theory, check out this video I recorded here. I also thought that what might be useful is a related discussion on Marxism and the value of political philosophy. I learned that about 20% of social scientists identify as Marxist. This could just mean that they find value in the political system inspired by Marx, or it could be deeply problematic in the long term. So for a discussion on that, check out this video here. My ultimate hope with this sequence of podcasts is to convince my peers on the political right of the value of analyzing group oppression and inequality. And on the other hand, my goal is also to convince my more radical peers on the left of the potential long-term counterproductive impact of, burning the system down or just doing away with our liberal values completely. All right, back to it. Well, so maybe the right lens through this is critical theory. So critical theory, critical race theory, critical queer theory, critical gender theory are, I think, the nexus of Marxism and postmodernism. Would you agree with that?
I think when you bring critical theory in, you can see the connections become a little bit more clear.
Right. Okay. So just maybe to recap, to steelman the argument against critical theory, if we will. I've heard kind of three. I've talked to both of you about this before, but I've heard three critiques of it, and maybe we can assess whether these are true. But the first critique is that it's, critical theory is anti-enlightenment, anti-science. So the idea is critical theory grows out of postmodernism. What is postmodernism? It's broadly the claim that there is no objectivity, and anytime someone makes a claim to objectivity, they're doing so to gain power for their group. So like there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as truth in history. There's no such thing as truth. What's objectively good history, what's objectively good art, or what's objectively good science. Like it goes that far.
Or math, like logic.
Yeah, I think it can strike any of them, right? There's no such thing as truth. And anytime you make an objective claim toward truth, you're doing so for power. So the Nazis were like this, it's easy to target the Nazis. The Nazis were like, Jews are inferior and Gentiles are superior. The Aryan race is superior. And well, why are they making this objective claim about a fact? It's because their motive is to get rid of all the Jews, right? But it's more than just, well, and I guess it's fair. Like you think about history, and that's fair enough. Like who's been writing most of the history we consume in the West? It's straight white men. Like, and so it's like obvious that the biases of straight white men will be apparent and exaggerated in the history we tell ourselves. So I do think like if we're to give critical theory its due, it's an extremely important endeavor to take into account the power plays that have been made in history and to reanalyze our current conception and cultural context in terms of those things. That's an extremely important endeavor. So I don't want to like diminish that, but it does go a little bit far when you make the claim about like science. So we talked about this, that I don't know how representative this is, but there's this one instance of a Smithsonian Smithsonian exhibit at a Smithsonian museum that was on whiteness, and it got redacted actually by the museum, and it was saying, well, whiteness is like here's some of the things that categorize whiteness, and it mentioned like rationality and empiricism, and their point was like, well, these are just as equally valid as methods of knowing about the world that focus on story and anecdote, and they would characterize those as, I guess, black in this context. And I think this is extremely harmful, like to say that like rationality empiricism isn't something that black people can do and something that's like for white people, because it's an objectively valued thing. It's a good thing, and it's part of the Enlightenment. It's what helped us get to where we are at the moment. And to denigrate them is also to denigrate our ability to stay in touch with reality and to function as a society. So I think it goes a little bit far when it says like science is just a value that happened out of whiteness in history. But I do think the endeavor of re-inspecting history and inspecting what we do value through the lens of power and who has had power is an extremely important endeavor. But I think that I guess there's two more things I want to mention, and then I want to let you guys speak because I've been monopolizing this for a while. One thing is that if you just look at it through power and just agree with claims because of who they support, you will believe a lot of untrue things, and you will believe a lot of things that push people running and screaming to the other side who believe in rationality. So like if I hear a political proposition, and maybe I'm an anti-racist, and I am, and I would identify with that term, and that I want to make the world a less racist place. But if I just hear a claim and I'm like, yes, that is supporting an oppressed minority, let's say black or female or some other category you could pick. If I'm just like, okay, now I agree with that claim because it supports them. Well, like you're going to believe a lot of untrue things, and that's actually going to be counterproductive in the long term. Even if you think like agreeing with that would get you a lot of like likes on Facebook or in your bubble. But like the point here also is that facts, I think there are a set of facts out in the world. We need to discover what they are, and then we can't make our discrimination and our like racism and anti-racism contingent on those facts. The facts are contingent, regardless of what they are. We need to like promote the values that we hold. So the kind of one thing I want to mention here, and then I'll let you guys talk, is Gun, Germs, and Steel. So Gun, Germs, and Steel is a book on how trying to explain a very touchy and very important topic of why did Europe colonize the rest of the world? Is it because they were evil? Is it because they what happened? And the claim is that, well, first of all, you have to realize it's an extremely important like claim to investigate, right? Because if you're a racist on like the far right and you believe in like white supremacy, you're going to say, oh, obviously white people are genetically superior and that's why they did it. And that's like something we need to have an explanation for why it's not that. And if you're on the far left, you're going to say like it would, maybe they were the more expansionist and colonialist power, and maybe not go into why. But I think it's really important that we do go into why. So the answer is, well, the Europeans had gun germs and steel. That was the proximate cause. Okay, why did they have better gun germs and steel? The ultimate cause gun germs and steel proposes is that it's because Eurasia was horizontally laid out on the globe. So every place within there shared the same latitude. And so it was a lot easier to do trade across the same climate. And there were a lot more domesticable animals and domesticable plant species. And so basically this enabled a lot more commerce, a lot more trade, and the technology that ultimately allowed gun germs and steel to be developed, and then the technology allowed for colonization. It's not saying like they were more evil or less evil than any other people or anything like that. It's just saying they had the technology. And I think this is extremely important, but there also is opposition on the far left to this idea, just because, well, saying they had better technology means they had a better process that led to this technology, better, let's say, science, because science leads to like the development of gun germs and steel. Not germs, but, well, yeah, germs, because it leads to like, people living in close proximity with animals in big cities. And I think the far left, there's a tendency to say, well, no, like the scientific achievements of Latin America, the vertically oriented continents, and Africa were equal, on par with like what the Europeans had achieved. And if you say that, then you have no explanation like to resort to. And so I think it's important we get our facts right, not letting ideology blind us. And then from there we can say, okay, well, like given that this is what happened, what do we do about it? We're not going to like say, we're not going to resort to white supremacy and say these people are biologically inferior. We have a plausible account, and now we can say like we shouldn't discriminate based on this account, and we have a good reason for why this happened. How do we remedy it? That's the main picture I want to paint. And I would agree with this also in terms of like, I'm Jewish, but in terms of Nazism, I would say even if it had turned out that the Nazis were right, that Jews like were, let's say less intelligent genetically, that the facts are contingent. That might be true, that might be false. But given what we find out, we have to assert is our value not to treat people differently based on that. Okay, sorry, I've been monopolizing this conversation. So,
do you have a question?
And I have a question.
Well put.
That was just on Enlightenment and critical theory. Is that a fair critique of critical theory? Like, are there people who actually believe that we should get rid of Enlightenment values other than this one exhibit that I've heard of anecdotally in the Smithsonian?
Yes.
You think yes?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I take as an example of like this kind of thinking run amok, like the crazy stuff that happens on campuses. Like we talked about that one example, Brett Weinstein. Well, we didn't actually really talk about him, but he wanted to discuss at his university the implementation of new like courses that they were going to be teaching on like equity and inclusion and diversity, things like that. And he wanted to discuss in a class how biology can influence the way that we see the world, the way that we respond to certain factors in the world, and talk about biological diversity. He wanted to do a course on that and where that shows up in the natural world. And then all these people were like, we need him off our campus, like, because he's trying to teach us science. So there are some people who don't like science because it seems offensive. Like he's going to talk about biology.
I thought he was kicked off campus because there was some controversy about him opposing diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Wait, Tyler,
yes,
can you steel man the argument? Because I don't even understand what the argument is, based on what you said.
No, so Jake's correct. So I left out a piece of it, which is that he wanted to have more of a discussion on these new courses they were implementing and basically going to be requiring teachers to sit under. He wanted to have like a forum to talk about it and learn more about it where, and if you guys have to watch that documentary, it's so good. But if you watch that documentary, the school just started implementing all this stuff without asking the professors what they thought or how they would understand these issues, etc. And he wanted to just have a forum and talk about it. Relatedly, he wanted to do he's a biology professor. He wanted to teach on biological diversity. He wanted to give like a few classes on that, just as like a tied to this new talk of diversity, inclusion, equity. He wanted to do like an interesting course on like biological diversity. So that's tied to it. But the main reason they were upset at him was because he wanted to talk about these new courses that they were implementing and the new direction the school was going in. And basically what happened is a bunch of people at the school barricaded people in the library. They were like, you need to get this guy off campus because he disagrees with us. And this is exactly how it comes back to critical theory. Their issue wasn't with whether or not his disagreements made sense or not. The issue was that the student body perceived it as him being opposed to the voice of the minority students. So it didn't matter what his critique was, even if he didn't have one, even if he just wanted to like say, hey guys, can we just talk about this first? That was viewed as he is against minority rights or hearing minority voices or listening to the minority experience. And so, yeah, those people like that think that science or any rational disagreement is a bad thing because it means that people are free to justify their opposition to minority voices. And they can't see it otherwise. They can't, because of this notion that all claims to truth are really just fundamentally power grabs. What he's saying when he's saying, I want to talk about this, is really, I want to maintain my power as a white person. He doesn't actually want to talk about it or think through it. He's using claims to like intellectual inquiry to mask the fact that he's just a oppressor who wants to keep his position. So yeah, there are many people who think that that's a meaningful way to approach human relationships and reality, is to just assume the worst of everyone and shut them down thereby.
There's a lot of threads to pull in here. I guess I don't know enough about this case to steelman it or assess your steelmanning of it. I do know that there was a kidnapping involved, right? Like and a barricading, I think. So yeah, I was shocked by the amount of violence against this person for what he was saying, and that surprised me. One thread you mentioned was like, to believe the students because they're the minority students because they're a minority. And there's a lot of philosophical things that need to be discussed here. Like, I think that it is true that, for instance, minorities' voices should be raised because historically they haven't. And I think representation is important. So that's something I want to preface with. I also want to say that, it's easier to trust the intent of a minority when you're talking about minority issues. So it's easier to trust the intent of a Black person when talking about racism than a white person. And that's fair. Like, if I think about participating in politics in Nazi Germany, if I hear a Jew speaking about Nazism versus a Gentile speaking about Nazism, I'm going to trust the Jew more. And I think that's fair. So I don't want to completely say that this is wrong, and I want to, assert the merit of that.
And that's because, just to clarify that point, that's just because one person is fighting for understanding and decency, and another is presumably fighting for dominance and destroying the other person.
Yes, and not in the German case.
Right, in a framework of a power.
Right. So the question is, how much does that map onto the situation at Brett Weinstein? And then also there is the philosophical thing to discuss here of one of the tenets of critical theory, I think, is, and this is again where I'm going to be criticizing, is the privileging of lived experience over scientific empirical investigation. And I think lived experience is important because it allows you to trust the intent of the speaker, but I fundamentally also don't philosophically believe that the way we should be uncovering truth is through anecdote. So if we're trying to make politics and we're trying to figure out what we know and can really trust is true out there in the world, it can't be based on anyone's stories. It has to be based on rigorous data and empiricism. And that can be empiricism about people's subjective
That's what I was
experiences.
going to say.
It can be the statistic that 90% of Jews think Nazis are evil. That's fine. Like, I think that's important. But it can't be this one person said this, therefore, like, this Jew said that all the Nazis are doing this, therefore we're going to tear down the government. But that is different, because we could say, well, 99% of Jews believe there are evil Nazis out there trying to get them, and then we should really consider tearing down
That's
the
a
Nazi
very
government.
important distinction. And I think a lot of these disagreements come from like people not knowing whether like, I mean, basically, like, I think maybe the left will say, okay, this is an anecdote about a lived experience, but this is representative, and so it is a fact that a large group, whatever significant size of people, feel this way, and that's a problem. And I think most, empathetic people would agree with that, regardless of their political ideology. But then I think where there's a lot of tension is like people. I mean, it's a very hard thing to get data on, or maybe, I mean, some of these questions, some are not, but I don't think there is a lot of good data about this either. These
right.
like objective facts about people's lived experience. And so the left is kind of assuming that it is a large group, or a significant proportion that we would care about, that we would want to make policy changes based on, or whatever. And the right maybe says we don't have evidence for that, so no.
Right. So I think it is maybe the fundamental divide here is whether you err on the side of, when we don't have data, what side do you err on? And I think that in that case, I would agree we should err on the side of protecting minorities. But I do think there are some things for which we do have data, and still anecdote is given preference. But it's hard for me to lay that just at the feet of critical theory, because I think the far right certainly uses anecdotes too. When we talk about, like, immigration, this farmer lost his job to this person, therefore all farmers are losing their jobs to all people, and therefore we need to, like, do something about this, and it's going to harm the economy as a whole. So it's very hard to lay anecdote just at the feet of the far left. But it also is, I think, explicit in critical theory that anecdote in some sense should be given preference over empiricism.
Well put.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this conversation isn't fair to you guys, because I've thought about these topics before.
No, I agree with that, because yeah, actually, I think that is the critical difference. Well, this is what you were implying by all that you were saying. The nature, you have to assess a claim based on the nature of the claim. So if somebody says to me, I was the victim of racially motivated police brutality, and then they explain their story, I'm going to say, wow, that's terrible. I believe you. If they then say, therefore, the policing in America is systemically racist, I'm going to say that's a radically different claim. And that
claim needs data, right?
Right. That's the point. Yeah. So, but critical theory doesn't make that distinction, because it would even go further than that. It would say even the data has been collected or framed in such a way as to serve the interests of the hegemonic power.
Yeah, and there is some truth there. There is some truth there, right? Like if you think about, there was I think a ProPublica investigation of policing, and it showed how, like, there was a cycle between where the algorithm, because they were using a computerized algorithm to choose where the police officers were deployed, and there was like a feedback loop between the algorithm and the community. So it was saying, like, okay, there's more crime in this area, we send more police. There's more police there, we get more crime reports. Now we're going to send more police, and you get positive feedback loops. And maybe that wouldn't have happened if you'd had more Black people, like, thinking about that decision. So it is fair to be critical of your sources of data, but if you trust the source of the data, like that, you ultimately need to make policy decisions based on trustworthy sources of data, is my fundamental view.
I agree with that, but that's not where critical theory leads. It doesn't lead because you can't trust anybody if they have power. So like this, it's a very dangerous line of thinking, because you can apply it to something like vaccines, for example. The manufacturers of the vaccines have a vested interest in making people believe that they're highly effective. Therefore, I'm suspicious of their claim that it's 95% effective. I'm not actually.
Well, that's more evidence that the far right does the same thing, right? Like maybe it isn't just endemic to critical theory, just any far left or far right ideology.
Right, but that's just to say that the far right has also embraced a critical theory for their way of thinking. I'm not saying critical theory is leftist or rightist necessarily, but that kind of thinking is dangerous thinking, and it's a kind of thinking that's conceptualized explicitly by critical theory.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about two more points of this, and then I want to move on to Jordan.
And I will make a final comment. It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting how people selectively apprehend the world in that way. So, like, if the data showed that police brutality wasn't actually significantly worse against Black people than against white people, people would say, oh, well, we can't trust the data because there's a vested interest of the hegemonic power to skew that data. And that's viewed as like, oh, that's great, you're taking the side of the minority. But if a conservative was like, I don't trust the data on vaccines because there's a vested interest in pharmaceutical companies to make a lot of money, that's like, oh, you're a science denier. So it's
right.
interesting the ways in which this skews everyone's thinking, because it makes everyone hyper suspicious. Like, you have to be suspicious, but you have to be reasonable as well.
Right. This is kind of just condemning conspiracy theory.
Yes.
At this point. Yeah. Right. Which is an easy claim to get behind.
But but that's the point, though. It is a conspiracy theory too, if the data shows, and it's trustworthy data for all you know, that the vaccine works. It's a conspiracy theory to say that they're just saying that to make money. It's also a conspiracy theory to say that if the data shows that police brutality does not disproportionately affect people who are Black or Hispanic, it's a conspiracy theory to say, oh, that's just because they're skewing the data. It's a conspiracy theory both ways, born out of this way of thinking.
Well,
I do want to say something.
One conspiracy has historical evidence, but
yeah, I want to say something.
So does vaccine conspiracy theory.
Let's let Tyler.
So first, I mean, I think this is a given, but we should also, if this is a podcast, we should acknowledge we're all straight white men. So like, there is like, we are biased, of course. We have a particular experience, especially when it comes to like race, and other things.
We don't have the same experience.
We don't have the same experience.
That's not to say we're like.
We also grew up in the same place.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's a homogeneity here, of experience.
And so what I want, but I have one more thing to say.
Let me just quickly add one thing there. It's just like, that's not to say that we're like cynical cartoons of white people, but that is to say there is a valid critique here, right? That's what a conservative might say. What you're saying is like, oh, so we're all evil white people. Why do, like, that's obviously not true. But what I think you're saying, and what I'd like to reiterate, is that we all have the same lived experience, and that it's harder to trust the intent of someone who is not a part of the group being oppressed.
Right. In terms of race and gender, for the most part, we have like very similar experiences. More similar probably than like a Black person who didn't grow up in Marblehead. Yes. Just in terms of their racial experience of the world. So what I wanted to say about the conspiracy theory and critical theory idea is like, I do understand what you're saying, Tyler, and I agree in theory, but I think there is I don't know that it's like the only special case, but I think race is a special or different case, because with like vaccine and creation and stuff like that, like there aren't like a certain type of person, I mean, other than like race and, sex and stuff like that. Like there isn't a type of person who's been in power who necessarily has a specific view, other than like it is in their vested interest to like get people to use their vaccine. But that's like a thing that you can like it's like more of a conscious thing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Whereas race, like white people in power may, of course consciously and also subconsciously, like may do things or believe things that are part of their racial experience that like affect the way like they interact with the world and like the data they collect and then disseminate. So I don't want to like, I agree that there probably is a good amount of like selectively applying this kind of thing, but I
But
don't think
sometimes you have reason to
but
selectively apply
sometimes,
it.
yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
I would just disagree. I don't think that's a rational position. I think that's a position that, like, I think it's, so this is interesting. So there is a degree of wisdom in like siding on the basis of historical precedent with one
It's a
group
good
or
way to put
another.
it. Yeah.
But I
Where are
don't
you going?
but I don't think that so I think that that can be a wise thing, but I don't think it necessitates such making such a decision. Like it's not it that doesn't compel me to just accept this position. Like you might be wise to be like maybe we should, I would say it's more like wisdom in being cautious about those kind of issues, not taking a side or another. Like when there's ambiguous data and there's ambiguous experiences, you just have to be extra cautious. And there's a wisdom in cautioning on the side of those who have been historically victimized in a certain way. So I'd agree with that, but I don't think for you to just simply say I'm going to side with this group or that group
Yeah,
is
yeah,
a rational position per se.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I mentioned that like there's harm in doing that, I think explicitly, like it's counterproductive
Yeah.
to do that. I had mentioned that like I think, you know, we have to figure out the facts as they are, and that's an enlightened idea that to believe that there are facts, right? Postmodernists might even deny that, and then work from there about how we achieve our values. I do think there's something to be said also for the fact that facts are facts, but like which facts you attend to and how you frame them does have an agenda. So like Fox News versus CNN might like both say facts in their news segment 99% of the time. I mean that's not true, but let's say they it's not true, but let's say that's true. But what set of facts you attend to will imply a certain ideology. And so how you frame the facts and what you choose to mention is very important.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the two things I want to talk about before we move on to Jordan Peterson, still on critical theory, is there's two more critiques I've heard of it. One is that it's illiberal, and one is that it's anarchic. So if we just for a second talk about the illiberal critique, this is really where it connects to Marxism. So this is the connection that I wanted to bring in before, like how do postmodernism and Marxism connect? Maybe it's in the illiberal part of critical theory, if this is an accurate critique. So the like Marxist ideology is basically saying like not only do we believe in abolishing private property rights, but where it comes into conflict with liberal ideology, we should abolish the individual rights, right, in favor of the common good. I'm looking at the comments here. Okay, I'm not going to read these. I don't know what these say. Okay, so the idea is that when Marxism is like when the communal good comes into conflict with individual rights, we should get rid of the individual rights. And I think that is maybe in some aspect present in critical theory. So it's saying like when we have an oppressed minority coming into conflict with liberal rights, there are gray areas, and the question is, what side do we take? So there was a big issue in Canada recently that famously Jordan Peterson became controversial over, where they were saying like, I think one of the things in the bill was mandating people's preferred pronouns, right? And I think it's good to use preferred pronouns, and Tyler clearly, because he has his preferred pronouns in there, also would agree that it's good to use preferred pronouns.
Tyler Beck,
yes. The law, if I understand correctly, mandated that you use someone's preferred pronouns, and if you don't, it's a hate crime. And so that's where free speech, which is a traditionally liberal value, right? Liberal being like individual rights, civil rights, democracy. When these two things come into conflict, we should prefer the community rights in Marxism or the oppressed group right in critical theory. So like if democracy comes into value with economics, we prefer communism. That's what a Marxist would say. And maybe a critical theorist would say, if hate speech comes into conflict with free speech, we should always get rid of free speech in order to make sure there's no hate speech. And these are things that I think are still being resolved. They're kind of at the gray area of what society believes is right or wrong, and I think they're still being hashed out. But maybe this would be a critique of the critical theory and kind of where it meets, where the rubber hits the road with Marxism. And I think the connections are explicit. Like, the people who developed critical theory mentioned that it came out of postmodernism and Marxism, and I think Paulo Freire, something like that, was a Brazilian communist who I think worked on a lot of critical theory. I think one interesting look at this now is these chat comments keep popping up, and I don't but okay. One way to look at this now is like, well, let's consider Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He proposes a new definition of racism, which I think is like fundamentally the divide between, when I talk about racism and sexism and like all the isms, all the hatred and like bigotry from my generation to the generation above us, before us. The main conflict and conversation comes when like I'm using the word, let's say sexism, to mean like inequality, disparate outcomes and political inequality distributed in the United States, outcomes distributed unevenly, inequality between men and women in the United States. And like our parents would maybe conceptualize sexism as interpersonal bigotry and discrimination, and not at a societal level. But then the confusion here is like, well, okay. So first of all, this is an extremely important, like, I think, ideological perspective switch, because like, even if we got rid of all the interpersonal discrimination, there's still, as I mentioned before, like the historical reasons why communities of color are marginalized, why they tend to group around like poor central communities that have not been invested in. So I think it's like almost more appropriate at a societal level to use this definition based on inequality of outcome. And I think at an individual level, as in your day-to-day lives, like think more about, you know, interpersonal bigotry and how you cannot discriminate in your day-to-day life. But that's why I generally agree with this definition, right? I think I'm a proponent of it. But where you might attribute this to where it could go wrong in critical theory is that if you call this inequality between the races, you call this racism, and you forget about the old definition, then you import all of the abhorrence that comes with the old definition into the new definition. And the new definition is generally abhorrent, but there can be situations where something is going to maybe not promote equality between the races because of historical circumstance, and yet we don't want to go there. So like maybe saying you have to hire exactly 50% men, 50% women, no matter who you find, like that's maybe a caricature of affirmative action. So it's not really what people are proposing, but let's say that's what you believe. Like that would solve to a large extent. It would remediate sexism, perhaps. Let's say in the United States, but that is an anti-sexist solution that is not liberal, you know, in its nature, because it removes the right to reward what you see as the most qualified candidate. Now, there's also the response to that like liberalism as a political philosophy requires an equal starting point. And so what you're saying is, okay, well, we're going to take steps to equalize the starting point. But the question is, what illiberal steps can you take to equalize the starting point? And there is some danger in importing abhorrent concepts to the new definitions, because then like what chance does any liberal right stand in the face of being like, you know, sexist? But I think that it's important to realize, like, you know, we can't, there's this gray area where people are hashing it out now of like, what liberal rights can we get rid of in order to equalize the starting point? And that would be the critique of critical theory, is that it's illiberal in its method of choosing to fix the problem.
And it's utopian as well, just to tie it back to communism.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as equal starting points. It can't be done. Everyone is born into a different environment. Unless you can imagine a newly created human race where just everyone is just pops into existence in the same exact place with the same exact body shape, with the same exact looks, with the same exact etc. There is no such thing as an equal starting point, even among any two individuals.
That's true for individuals, but
And groups.
No, when you start seeing differences on average in large groups, you can assume that there is something, like, unless you are going to take the route that white supremacists usually go down of saying there's a biological difference, then I think you have to acknowledge that there is a societal problem when there's vast differences between groups of people. So, like, maybe there's variance between equal individuals, and you can't say these in any way these two individuals are the same. But when you start seeing massive differences and disparities between outcomes of groups, you know there's a problem there.
I agree with that, but that's not a liberal idea. So liberalism historically doesn't care about group outcomes. It cares about individual rights, protecting individual rights, giving individuals equal footing. So to ask the question, why are there group differences, and how do we make sure that the groups start on the same playing field, is not a question that a politically liberal person historically would be interested in answering. They'd be interested in answering how do we mitigate these disparities if they are in fact the result of discrimination and historic injustice, etc., but not how do we give each group an equal starting point, because that is to fundamentally miss the point that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the ought to be the possession of each individual, not different groups. But if it's historical liberalism, that is, doesn't ask the question of groups, but of individuals.
But if you're an individual and you're a member of a group that is, doesn't have an equal starting point, doesn't that imply that you have an unequal starting point?
As an individual. But the nexus of this, where this becomes a concern for liberals historically, is how do we ensure those rights to the individual regardless of their group? It's the group is like, what matters is the individual fundamentally, not the group he belongs to. And so if you address the individual needs, and you guarantee to each individual certain rights, you will necessarily see that each group is given certain rights. So disparity in outcome is the question that communists and Marxists want to solve by implementing Marxism or communism, etc. But liberals historically have been most concerned with ensuring that individuals have these rights.
But I think, to the point, like, in order to, what Jake just said, I think made sense. Like, to ensure that individuals have the same rights means that there's no group that you could belong to that would imply a different starting point, like, on average. So, like, it might not be that, like, groups need to, it might not be that we need to examine the groups, but, like, well, I think you do, in order to say that, like, individuals have the same rights. Like, no two individuals will ever have exactly the same, circumstances, and therefore, like, whatever. But if there are on average differences between groups, that means that, like, individuals are always going to be different on average across groups.
Right, and I think Ibram X. Kendi here would say something like, well, one of the things he mentioned anyway is that you can't be colorblind and just treat people as individuals at a societal level in order to find the problems. Once you do, I think he does believe that, like, a lot of the solutions will, or any solution that helps, poor white people is going to help poor Black people. And so maybe the remedies don't necessarily need to be group based, and they can be individual based, but you need to have the lens of the group perspective in order to address the individual rights.
Because, like, it might be correlated with some attribute of your group, and to just ignore that attribute means you're going to miss the underlying cause, and you will never be able to remedy the situation.
Yeah, I'm simply observing that this way of thinking is not a historically liberal way of thinking. It's a collectivist
Hmm.
or communistic way of thinking.
Well, it might not be historically liberal, but it might be in line with that historical liberal value.
No, it's not. So it would be like, I mean, collectivism just isn't compatible with liberalism historically.
But is it collectivism?
Yeah, you're saying that groups need to have the same outcomes.
So that individuals will have the same outcomes.
Right. That's not how a liberal would historically think of it. They would say we need to think about what the individual has first. The other thing I think that's important is to say that I think that recently, I don't know if because of Kendi, but people like Kendi who writes similar kind of stuff about disparities. They just say that it's wrong that there are disparities between groups. Like they just assert it. But every disparity is different. So like, I don't personally think it's wrong that the majority of NBA players are black, like the vast majority. I don't think that's a disparity, but that's not a result of injustice. Like, so, but that's the problem though.
No, but when you see the disparity, you need to inspect it for injustice, right? I think that's the
Do you think we should
message.
investigate why there are more black NBA players than white NBA players?
I think it's clear that that's not like a negative outcome that is the consequence of historical legacy of discrimination.
Injustice against white people.
Right.
So right, but the point is that there are group disparities that aren't the result of injustice.
Yes, I don't think that's.
Okay. But people are not given that impression. The impression is, oh, there are less women in X position, therefore injustice. There are like,
and this is where like history again comes into play. Well, no, I agree that this therefore that is fallacious, but like this is again where context and history is a huge determinant. Like we know that until the 20th century there was like rampant discrimination against women, and opportunities weren't available to them. So like it's pretty clear from history that you need to inspect differences in those groups, and you need to inspect differences between like ginger people and like blonde people.
But no. I don't get this impression that finding out whether or not the disparities are really the cause of injustice is actually the goal of people like Kendi. He assumes that every disparity between especially blacks and whites is necessarily the result of injustice.
Well, he goes through some alternative explanations.
Right, but
he does
obviously his answer is that it's injustice. So he pays lip service to alternate theories, but I don't think he's actually interested in finding out whether or not they actually are the result of injustice. So quick example.
I don't know if that's a fair critique of him.
Yeah, I don't know if it is either. I haven't read his book yet. So I'll read his book and then I'll come back. But just a quick example and then you guys can talk. I've mentioned this study before. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but this was the idea in Sweden, for example. There were vastly more doctors than male doctors than there were female doctors. And so the leftists in Sweden were like, this is an injustice. Like, there's discrimination going on in hiring, there's discrimination going on in etc. Or there's just the idea in culture that women shouldn't be doctors. So they changed everything about their system. And I've referenced this study to you guys before, and this ties to Jordan Peterson because this is the one he brings up when he's talking to, when he's in dialogue with various feminists. So they did everything they could to equalize the system of hiring in the medical world, giving more opportunities for women who want to study medicine in university, high affirmative action type stuff in universities for women. And they found that just as many women as previously chose to be nurses. So what does that mean? That means potentially that means
nurses or doctors.
What?
Nurses or doctors?
Nurses. Women were still choosing to be nurses, vastly disproportionate.
Oh, over being
a doctor.
Okay.
So basically that explodes the idea that was popular at the time, that the reason for this was simply because of societal impediments. Whereas maybe it's possible that women have different predilections than men do, and women are more caring than men on average, maybe, or want to be in closer personal contact with patients than male doctors do. That wouldn't be a matter of injustice. That would be a matter of there's just some different predilections on average between men and women.
So can I jump in?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I think that we need to err generally on the side of inspecting for historical injustice because we know that exists in a lot of cases, including discrimination against women. I think that it is important to actually then decide whether in some instance is the result of discrimination, historical discrimination or not. I think that for women in particular, as opposed to, let's say, Jews and Gentiles, like it's a lot easier to make a case that there are personality differences because like there is difference in biology between sexual women and sexually male people. And so like you can tell that there's been a lot of studies, as far as I can tell, into the difference in personality between men and women. And usually it's like on average, they're off by like the means are off by like, you know, less than 1% or something like that. But then this is a point I've heard before, and I think it's a good one that Jordan Peterson makes, which is that you look at the tails of these distributions, like the far extremes. And just because the means are shifted, like the two normal distributions, you shift them by 1%, the percent of people who are in the top 1 percentile might be mostly men or mostly female, just because the distributions are shifted a tiny bit. You can see this with athletics, right? So most people in the Olympics, if it were not thrown out of men and female competitions, they'd be men because on average, like the means for men and women athletically are very close, but the tails are very different. So if I were to steelman your argument, I would say, yes, that exists. And also what exists is there are some studies that showing the more egalitarian a society's policies are, the greater the difference in expression between career choices, I believe, which is the opposite of what you would expect. And I think the authors that went into it trying to show the opposite thing. And that's really surprising. And it is hard to disentangle the role of culture because you wouldn't expect like any society to be completely free. I think this was done largely, like Scandinavia was a good example of this. And you would still expect they're consuming a lot of American culture that has, you know, let's say sexist stereotypes, but you don't expect them to be consuming more than the other countries they're comparing to. Like we are like adjusting for that. So if you just look at the dimension of egalitarian politics, not assuming any are more or less like consuming more or less sexist media, then you rank them in terms of least to more egalitarian policies. It turns out the countries that are more egalitarian have greater differences in outcomes for like men and women. What's interesting here is that like you might say, okay, well, men and women, more women choose careers that are traditionally less rewarded in a capitalist system. And I think there's a couple of things to be considered here. Like one is, well, maybe we should be giving the jobs that women have more economic, like paying them more so they have more economic power. And B is if we don't do that, like maybe it makes the individual person happier to choose, like let's say nursing instead of doctor, but you make less money, and on average that means women have less money, which means on average women have less power, which means on average women have less political representation, which means on average women have less say in politics. So like I do think there's a group reward that is diminished even if the individual is happier. So like, you know, maybe it still is possible to remedy that in some way. There's a solution there, whether it's pay these things more, like pay certain careers more, or like some other form of remediation that can make sure there's the same amount of like monetary and political power on the side of both groups.
Yeah, which is a different consideration though than is it unjust that there are way less women doctors than men?
Yes.
That's all I'm saying.
But again, I do want to also emphasize that like these things in general should be inspected for historical context because there's a huge amount of historical discrimination.
Wait,
okay.
Can I say one more thing on that?
Yeah, I'm going to mute myself for a second while I go get a snack.
Okay. I also think, though, I'm skeptical of any study that's like, we added some measures and like all of sexism and the boundaries for women for being doctors didn't disappear. Like what? Like that, it's just not. My perspective is that these problems, the root cause, part of the root cause of a lot of these problems, like sexism and racism, are so deep and so psychological that you can't just make a few policy changes and expect that it's going to fix everything. Like there's still like I think it's difficult to feel like as long as the culture is dominated by men and like there isn't, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a great way of putting this, but I think like what I was saying before is kind of what I'm trying to say in the abstract. Like, I would be shocked if if they ran a study on like, oh, we like, you know, we added some affirmative action and like blah blah blah, and that like didn't fix everything. And I know they weren't going for like fix everything, but like it might not fix anything, and that wouldn't even be that shocking to me.
Right, but it shouldn't necessarily fix anything, but it should show up somehow in the data. Like if there's any merit to this idea that like it's societal, then taking away some of the societal impediments should make some difference. But in these studies, they've made zero difference, and even as Jake said, aggravated them. So in Sweden, for example, same study, Sweden's one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. Like more women now are nurses than previously. Like, and less of them are doctors. Like, so that doesn't make any sense at all. But I think that the main thing is like people think it's wrong that more women want to be nurses. Like that's weird to me. Like if women want to be nurses, they should be free to be nurses. I don't think we should socially engineer people to like have different predilections. But it seems most women in most countries would rather be a nurse than a doctor. So I don't know. I think women should be free to decide their occupations.
Yeah, but I go back to the group like dynamics like that result from that as one thing. And the second is, we have to inspect history because there's a great amount of discrimination. So we have to make sure that's not at play. And like, I guess ultimately on the far left, you get like social constructionists who believe that there are no biological differences between men and women. And like we're infinitely malleable. So in the absence of societal imposition, we would be 50-50. And on the far right, you get biological determination, which is like, men and women are only doing this because of their genes and there's no societal discrimination at all, which I do think is the more dangerous belief. If we were to pick one out as a more dangerous belief. All right, so the last thing I want to quickly go through before we go to Jordan Peterson is still in the critical theory. So I think we've done a good job of critiquing and then also upholding the positives of critical theory. But I think still ultimately we would come down on the side of like there is a way in which it can go too far. And I think this is exemplified by the last dimension, which is that it's anarchic. So let's see if you agree with this. But I think like critical race theory is ultimately a populist movement that's saying like, we have whatever group is being oppressed, because usually there's an oppressed group in critical theory. We're on their side, and so we have the moral high ground. But like it's also paradoxically ready to toss out like democracy and liberal values for the sake of the oppressed group, even if let's say the majority of the oppressed group doesn't agree and like upholds anecdotes from this one group as evidence. But I think it takes this and it throws out the values like democracy. So it's just taking a goal, which is equality of outcome, which is generally a good thing in the absence of discrimination, or in absence of like preferred outcomes from one group or the other. And it's trying to equalize them. Generally a good thing, but can go too far. And it's taking that goal and it's replacing things like liberal values, right? So it's taking liberal values and replacing them with let's tear down the system. So it's taking a liberal structure for government, a liberal political philosophy, and replacing it with a goal that is anarchic and is fundamentally not a grounding for a society. And so it kind of puts nothing viable back in its place. It's saying like the system we have is fundamentally corrupt. Any participation in it is corrupt because it's based on power dynamics. And so you can't participate in it, you have to tear it down. And this, out of the three like critiques that we've been going through, this is the one that I find most, I don't know about compelling, because I can't even say like precisely that this is the most apt description, but this is, let's put aside critical theory, like this is the tendency on the far left that I see as and some degree on the far right also as most destructive. It's like the system we have now needs to be completely torn down. But you know, again, we have this political divide where, and I tend to find myself on the side of progressivism, which is we need to make radical change because we're heading towards danger and we need to a precipice that we need to get rid of. And then the conservatives are like, no, let's stay where we are. And it's easy to say that benefits some people because it does, some groups of people over others. But there also needs to be like a recognition of like the free markets we have are the things that are lifting 75% of the world out of poverty. And like we need to be, you know, we can't just be complacent in the system we have. We have to recognize the good things it's brought, and it's brought a lot of good, and then fix the bad. And I don't think that's a very controversial opinion, but I do think there are people on the far left, and I've seen a lot of them saying like the institutions we have, whether it's like the legal system or the police system, and there's a lot of criticisms of both of those that I have, but it's like, get rid of them completely. We don't need them, just throw them out the window. And I think that that is an anarchic tendency that can be dangerous.
But I mean, are people saying get rid of them and don't put anything in their place? I don't think anyone's arguing that.
No, I've seen a lot of people argue that. Like, I do think I've seen people say, well, there is a police abolition movement, right? Like, let's get rid of the police and not
But
put
that
anything
still
in their
doesn't
place.
mean don't put any, like, you know, whatever. I don't have it, like public safety organization in its place. It means get rid of the police, which is a certain form of that.
Well, I think what they say is put in its place is reinvesting in communities and like to get rid of poverty and the cycle of poverty.
Right.
And I agree with
and
that.
included in that is like people who like help stop crime. It's just not like the only people that are all trained the same way and have guns and show up to every single 911 call.
Yeah, maybe that's fair.
I don't see any. I mean, of course there are anarchists, and I think that's a fair. What you said was a fair critique of anarchists, but when I see, and it could be an issue of communication, like it could be people saying, let's tear down the system, and just there isn't a quick Facebook way to say like, and here's like the 10-page thing I want to replace it with. But I don't know if to, you know, to give credit to their argument is what I'm trying to do. I don't know if many people are saying like tear down the system and don't replace it with anything. Like I don't know if that's a real argument for anything more than like a handful of people.
So what I'm thinking of here is particularly like police abolition and prison abolition. And I think there's like a really strong need to fix the incredible racial disparities in these two systems. So I don't want to like minimize that issue. But I have seen people, you know, defund the police has been a popular rallying cry. And you ask people what that means. And for some, it's not one thing. For some people, it means like break apart the police into several smaller agencies that are better equipped to handle specific situations. And I think that's a good thing. Then some people are calling for just police abolition and to not put any type of like, because they see the use of force to compel people to do things as inherently bad. That's the anarchist view. The government shouldn't be exerting force to force us to do anything. And that's the philosophy I think that's dangerous. And I saw something on Facebook yesterday that was like someone post defunded the police and then crossed it out. And they're like, you know, reconstitute the police, reform the police, get rid of the police and replace it with X, Y, and Z and social security, not social security, social safety systems. And I agreed with all the things, but then I looked at the comments and I was like, half the people agreed and half the people were like, no, all cops are bastards. Fuck them all. They're all pigs. Get rid of them. Like, you know, we don't need anything like this ever again. And it's hard to disentangle that from like, get rid of a corrupt institution,
right,
that you see as irredeemable, or get rid of this corrupt institution and replace it with something like that's basically the same but doesn't have the same history of racial oppression.
I agree, but I think it is when someone says, you know, all police are bastards, get rid of police. Again, that doesn't mean and don't replace it with any form of social safety organization. Like it could just again, I don't know what the intent. It could very well be that a lot of people feel that way. I think a good number of people do. I mean, but I don't think many do. I think
Mm.
I think still yeah, I think there's still, I think most people, that's an it's because it's an easy, it's a much more concise message to say like get rid of the police than to say like reshape, take the budget we currently have for the police and change it to be a very small fraction for, you know, whatever public safety involves violence, but or could involve the use of force, but then put most of those resources into mental health kind of preparation, people who can respond to mental health issues, um, people who can respond to homelessness, people who are homeless and like helping them. Um, and my gut, I mean, yeah, I don't know anything. I don't have any real numbers on this, but my gut is that most people who say like abolish the police are more on that side than on the like, and don't replace it with any form of like,
Well, no, I think everyone wants to replace it with social programs. The question is, do we also replace it with an armed security force that has the ability to compel people through the use of violence?
okay, yeah, I don't
And
know.
and I think there's a good number that think no, and I think that most think yes, and including like, well, the New York Times has done a poll, and it was like most Black people think that don't support the movement, quote unquote, defund the police.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it does get really tricky because, like as you're saying, the definitions of these things are slippery, and everyone means something slightly different. And this is the postmodern critique of like words have reference, and those reference aren't fixed. They change, and they change on context, and they change on like over time. So it's really hard to pin down what someone means when they say a phrase. Um, but yeah, I guess I don't have a problem with like defund the police as in like split it into smaller programs. What I was wondering is like how much of the critique is valid that there's just like pure anarchists out there who don't want the government to use force to compel people to do things. And I think to me that's fundamentally what a government is. It's people who have monopoly on the use of force. So we don't have to use force on each other to compel people to adhere to the laws that we've all agreed to. Now, to some extent, we haven't agreed because we were born into these laws. And in an ideal world, yeah, we'd have like I get to choose my country and I opt in to the social contract. But that's a little utopian for me. I don't think that's going to happen. So like I do think I'm a part of the social contract I'm in. I was born into, and I do think that that needs to be enforced. And it will sometimes, in a non-utopian situation, come down to the use of violent force, which isn't ideal, but I think is necessary.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I agree. I think that what this gets at is like the revolutionary impulse. So I agree with Tyler that a lot of the people saying defund the police don't want to just get rid of it and not replace it with something or have another solution to crime and police brutality, etc. But it's what we've seen with a lot of these protest movements is just kind of the revolutionary impulse where things have to change now. Right now they have to change, and when a matter seems that pressing to you, it's often the case that you don't have a long-term solution worked out. So and that ties back to even what with when we started with Marx had no idea how communism was going to come about, I should say. He just simply asserted that we need to end capitalism and communism is going to solve everything. So a lot of people are simply asserting if we
Well, he
defund
thought it. Didn't
all
he
these
think there was going
problems
to
will
be a
go away.
dictatorship of the proletariat that was going to establish?
Well, that's more Lenin than Marx. But Marx himself wasn't explicit about how it would come about. And it's a similar idea. Marxism is revolutionary. It sees the problems with capitalism and the inequalities that come about as a result, and therefore we have to burn it down. And so that's I think at play in a lot of this conversation, which doesn't mean there's not an alternative solution, but it just means that for a lot of people, the most pressing thing is just to tear down the current system.
Right. And I think the critique of anarchism I have is that like fundamentally when you tear down a system like this, what usually springs back in its place is not something better.
Yeah, right. I think it's tempting to think the current system is unworkable for me, and that's, I mean, I can certainly see that for a lot of people, and that's true for probably most of our country. But I agree that tearing it down doesn't mean it's going to get better. It could get a lot worse.
especially when tearing it down requires violence.
Right. And I think that, like, there were during the time of the communist revolutions, there were a lot of academics on the far left precisely arguing for, like, the need for communism, and not saying, they would say, I'm not supporting violent, bloody revolution. I don't want anyone to die or get hurt. And yet their writings directly impacted all these communist revolutions that killed millions of people. Like, not just millions, like tens of millions of people. So there's like some responsibility here, even when you're not advocating for violent revolution. If your ideas are revolutionary and don't have a reform in place to institute a necessary fix, there is some responsibility to promote something instead of just calling for an ideology that supports violent revolution, even if you yourself aren't saying, be violent.
Yeah.
And I think that this, like, comes back to a fundamental divide on the left and right between, we've talked about this before, but intent and impact. So, like, I think that the far left is, like, progressive in the sense that they want radical change, but they also are the side that wants to, like, make sure the impact is the best for minorities. And I strongly agree with that sentiment. But the thing about far radical change is that you don't know the impact. Like, the impact might be a violent uprising, and you only know the intent, even if the intent is good. And on the far right, you have the opposite paradox. But yeah, I guess the reason I'm on the left is that I err more on the side of we need radical change. Like, we need a lot of change. Yeah, next time we can debate objective and subjective morality, and how we ground our morals in a sense of objectivity, if we can, and in what that means.
So, viewer, stay tuned for next time.
Stay tuned, faithful listener.
Wait.